Hello photography fans, this is Robert LaFollette and I'm the wildlife photography instructor at Brian Peterson's School of Photography. Once again, we're back with 5 fresh critiques from fellow students right here at Brian Peterson's School of Photography. I'm going to be offering up some creative yet unique ways of not only enhancing the photographer's photo, but also for other photographers who may have similar issues or similar compositions, and they too would like to enhance their photographs. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive in to our first photograph. Our first photograph, entitled County Fair, sent to us by Serini, is a fantastic image of showing motion. Serini writes, this is a 2-second long exposure of rides at a local county fair. And one of the challenges of still photography is how to capture and express motion. And one of the easiest ways that I know how to do that is with long exposures. Serini picked the perfect subject to really showcase this, and for anybody who has ever been to a county fair with all those fantastic rides and the lights and the sounds and the motions and the smells, long exposures, especially when done in the evening, is the perfect opportunity to exploit that light and that motion. Now, one of the things that I really like about this is that it was simply a 2-second exposure, but it was just long enough to capture the lines to really enhance and show that motion, and that motion is conveyed to us in light. Now, one of the things that I want to mention, however, is that there's a tremendous amount of negative space in the upper left-hand corner, where you see all that vast, dark, black sky. Over to the right, we could see what seems to be the glow from a light that's off in the distance, out of frame, and that could be possibly a street light or maybe another ride there. So if Serini had been there just slightly earlier, say right at dusk, when you still have that dusky blue sky, or even a sky that had color from a beautiful sunset, or clouds that reflect that sunset, this is the perfect time to do these types of images. And what happens is that it adds further interest, and we get rid of all that black negative space. So here is a quick and dirty example that I quickly whipped up in Photoshop to kind of show and demonstrate, just by adding a little bit of color to that sky, how it dramatically enhances a already fantastic photograph. Quite a bit of a difference, don't you think? So again, Serini, and for anybody who is attempting to try photographs like this, especially when it comes to painting with light, timing of day is everything, and the perfect time is just after sunset, when we still have a little bit of color in the sky. So there you have it. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go on to photo number 2. Our second photo, Mandrill, comes to us from Steve. Now, Steve didn't give us any details, such as where he captured this photo or his camera settings, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Steve captured this probably at his local zoo, which is a fantastic location if you're just starting out in wildlife photography, because you don't have to travel very far, and you can go back numerous times. For every time you go back, you're going to see and capture something completely different that you never saw before. Now, one of the great things that I really like about this is that it is no different than perhaps if you were to go out and learn how to take photos of your friends or your family. This is a perfect example of a portrait. And wildlife portraits are really no different as far as the approach that you should take when capturing wildlife subjects such as this beautiful mandrill. It follows the rule of thirds, as Steve so brilliantly showcases here, is that the eyes are in the upper 1/3 portion of the frame. So you have a nice, beautiful, composed image. Now, one of the things that I will say, however, that is the images is a little dark for my taste. simply because it could have been that the lighting was poor, which usually is the case at most zoos, or the animal was probably more than likely in a dark, shadowy area of his enclosure. So what we want to do here is that if you were out on location, by simply adding, using exposure compensation, you could have added a little bit of light. However, if you didn't have the ability to do that, or maybe because the animal was moving around and you had a split-second decision to make to capture this photograph, we could easily do that in Photoshop. So it was simply by opening it up in Photoshop, all we would need to do is enhance our exposure. Again, we don't want to do it too much, but just a little bit to brighten it up a little bit. And the other thing what I would also want to and I would also obviously recommend too, is that the eyes are very dark, and the eyes are the connection here. This is where the viewer really gets intimate with its subject. So I would also go in and brighten up the eyes a little bit to make them pop out a little bit. Now I did a quick and dirty little demonstration here again of what I did, and I just basically did two things in Photoshop. As I gave it an overall exposure boost, if you will, and enhanced it up and made it a little brighter. And then I also went in and slightly touched up the eyes by making them pop out a little bit by opening up the exposure there as well too, or basically brightening it. And I think you will agree that it really makes it a huge difference. It makes it pop out. So with that being said, Steve, I think you did a great job. The exposure, I mean, everything, other than the little exposure issue, everything else as far as composition and depth of field and the sharpness and everything else is absolutely beautiful. And I think you did a fantastic job capturing, again, a very easy thing to do that you can do going to a local zoo or a place where they have captive animals and capturing some fantastic close-up images using your long telephoto zoom lens, and portraits of these animals are fantastic examples of just how you can do that. So with that being said, let's go ahead and let's move on to our next photo, photo number 3. Our third photograph, titled Logan Landing, was sent to us by Richard. And Richard writes, "I grabbed this shot just before touchdown." Now, I'm pretty sure that we can all figure out that he wasn't talking about touchdown as in football. He was talking about touchdown as landing in an airplane. So with that, he writes, "Midday afternoon on a gray Boston day. There is just something so iconic about landing at Logan Airport with the Bunker Hill Monument in your sights, and I was trying to capture that feeling. Because this is a fairly small crop out of a large photo, and I treated it for contrast and sharpness. It was too soft and dull originally. It had just a bit of a posterized nature that I really liked the combination with black and white. I also really enjoy the wide variety of tones and lines arranged in such a man-made manner." So with that being said, Richard, what I think you have here is what I would like to call old school photography, where days like this is a perfect opportunity to go out and look for anything that captures our eye, but don't see it in color. See it in 3 colors, which is gray, white, and black, which equals black and white photography. So this gray Boston day actually was kind of a bit of a blessing in disguise, where we completely disregard the colors of reds and oranges and blues and greens and yellows, and we're left with just the simplicity of black and white. Now, since we're going to go old school, what I'd like to do is I'd like to take it to another level and really make it look like something that possibly looks like it could have been shot 20, 30, 40 years ago on film. Now, one of the great things about black and white film photography is that you had some things that were very different back in the day when we're talking with film, and that was the lenses back in the day. They just weren't as good as what they are today when it comes to terms of sharpness. They were also soft in the corners, and they even sometimes, depending on the maker, always cause what we call vignetting, which is simply darkening of the corners. So now that we know the weaknesses of those lenses back in the day, why don't we bring them into the 21st century and actually showcase them in our digital photography, and in this case, a digital black and white photo. So obviously what Richard did is he desaturated the photo, and he probably played a little bit around with the settings, but here's what I'd like to do. I'd like it to take it to a whole nother level by kicking it up a notch, if you will. So if I take it into Photoshop, as I show here, and I added those 3 elements that we talked about, which is softening of the corners, vignetting, and also adding a little more pop with contrast, what we're left with is a little brighter whites, a little darker blacks, and the grays just stay pretty much the same. What I also did, however, is I also darkened up that really dull sky by adding a little bit of a graduated filter coming down from the top to make it look like maybe it's a little more gloomier than what it really was. So with that being said, this is a perfect opportunity, and Richard had the right idea by taking this photo and turning it into a black and white. Now, Richard probably had the same thought when he was touching down, landing at Boston Logan International Airport, that wouldn't it have been great had there been an airplane on that runway? Wouldn't it have really enhanced that opportunity? Of course it would. However, sometimes you got to take what's given to you, and I think Richard did a great job by, as opposed to sitting there reading the card in front of him or a magazine, he took his camera, pointed out the window, and got a snapshot, and he turned it into a wonderful, old-school throwback photo. So with that being said, let's go ahead and we'll move on to photo number 4. For our 4th photograph, titled On the Hunt inUtila, sent to us by Sandy. She writes, I was on the island of Utila, sitting on our back porch. Now, side note for me is I've never heard of Utila, so I had no idea what she was talking about, so obviously I did what most people would do, is I jumped over to Google, typed it in to see what comes up, and turns out this is a tropical island in Honduras. And based upon the photographs that I saw that is associated with this tropical island, what an absolutely beautiful place and a slice of paradise to take a vacation, which hopefully Sandy was, and enjoying herself there in Utila. So with that being said, she goes on to write, which in itself was overlooking a lovely swamp area that was amazing for wild birds to hunt. I quietly sat for over an hour, and the birds came closer to me, and while they hunted for fish, after a while, they didn't even know I was there. I think you may tell me that I cropped too close on my edges, for I cannot find my original to see if this was in camera or Photoshop. I actually think that this was in camera. What I wanted to do with this picture was make it look a little more about fine art. So I turned it into black and white and added a texture for a background and did a little oil painting in Photoshop. Your thoughts are appreciated. Love you guys. Well, Sandy, I can tell you that one of the things that I teach in my wildlife photography course is that it's those photographers, especially who want to succeed being a wildlife photographer, I should say, is that patience is the #1 trait that you need. It's not an easy undertaking, if you will, and this photograph, which by the way, I don't know if you knew this or not, this is what we have here, we find very often as well here where I'm from in Florida, is of a little blue heron. And if you're patient, you will be richly rewarded in your photography. Because after a while, they don't see you as a threat, and they'll go about their normal daily business. So with that being said, the critiques that I offer here is that when it comes to turning photographs into fine art, I absolutely have no problem with that. And there is a huge market for this type of photography, and it's something that many people don't even think about when it comes to especially wildlife photography. You also mentioned that you turned this into a black and white, and let me say that since we're going to go for that fine art appeal where it looks more like an oil painting, you typically don't see oil paintings in black and white. We associate oil paintings with color. So with that being said, as with the previous photograph, Logan Landing, that was sent in to us by Richard, which was a great opportunity for black and white, I think in this case, Sandy, I think, and you did send it in here, and we'll go ahead and throw that up here so we can see the difference here, is that it really looks phenomenal as a color photograph. Now, a little bit of room would have been, you're right, absolutely helpful in this case, but it's not a deal breaker for me. I think it's very well composed. The colors are fantastic, and obviously, since this is a lot of this is Photoshop. I can honestly tell you that I think you did a phenomenal job taking, you know, what typically would be a standard photograph that we probably see, you know, hundreds if not thousands of times if you were to type in Little Blue Heron. You've turned it into something that's uniquely your own and a completely different style, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing this type of work. And you never know, this might become it could become your specialty. And I encourage you to continue to explore turning your photographs into fine art, if that's what you like to do. So with that being said, Sandy, and before I go on to our fifth and final photograph, Sandy did say that this was taken with a Nikon D7000 at f8, ISO 200, and a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second. And one of the things that I do teach in my wildlife photography course is what I call my formula for success. And if I had to critique your camera settings, Sandy, you nailed every single one of them, because you have a great sharpness, which you'll get at f8. You had a beautiful background that was far enough away that f8 didn't really come into play to give a distracting background. And your shutter speed was in a beautiful range of 1/500th of a second. So you also had a nice tack sharp photo to begin with, and that's always good to start. Is that when you're doing the Photoshop work, is that the better quality image that you start off with, the better the end result will be. So again, thanks, Sandy. And so with that being said, we're going to go ahead and we're going to move on to our final photograph, photograph number 5. And now for our fifth and final photograph, titled Looking Glass Zoom, sent in to us by Jim. And he writes, I was at Robin Hill Park in Sequim, Washington, early one morning. I came upon a strand of western red cedars and started shooting. I remembered to try zooming in and out and got this shot. I used a Nikon D7100, Nikon 18 to 200 millimeter lens at 31 millimeters, ISO 100, f16 for 1.5 seconds. Now, majority of people, when they see an opportunity like this, they only take one shot, and that is your typical, here is a bunch of cedar trees in a forest. However, it's those who think outside the box, as Jim so creatively did here by using a technique where you slow the shutter speed down, where here he used a very small aperture of f16 and an ISO of 100, and at that, giving those two settings gave him an exposure of 1.5 seconds. And what you do is you slightly turn the lens going in or out while the camera is being exposed. Now obviously you don't want to do this hand holding. You want to be on a tripod so you're nice and steady. So all you should have to do is in one hand, which I always use a remote trigger, whether it's tethered or wireless, and my other hand is just slightly moving the lens, zooming it in and out. It gives this fantastic explosion of light, of color, of shapes, and contrast. And here we have what it looks to appear that the sunlight is bursting through these red cedar trees. Now, a little tip for you, however, is that if you don't have the shutter speed that you need to slow it down a little bit, this is a great opportunity to throw a neutral density filter on the front of your lens, which simply acts as a pair of sunglasses, if you will. It darkens it up, so it increases your exposure. Always have one of those handy and throw it in your bag for just such an opportunity. Now, one of the things that I've noticed right away, however, looking at Jim's photo, is it was very, very flat. It had no pop or appeal to it. I can see the forest through the trees, but I couldn't see it clearly. So taking it into Photoshop, all we need to do here is to add a little contrast and a little color, and bada boom, bada bing, we got a phenomenal photograph as I show here. Now, one of the things that you will notice that for those people that shoot JPEG, and they maybe at some point they hear these ramblings, whether it's from another instructor or they read it online or one of their other friends that maybe shoot digital photography, is they may have heard the term camera raw, and so they get curious and they start to shoot camera raw images as opposed to JPEGs. And you'll quickly notice there's a huge difference between the result of JPEGs and camera raw images. JPEGs, if you will, are prepared kind of like meatloaf. It's already got the seasoning, the sauce, the ketchup, the whatever you want to have. It's fully baked, ready to go right out of the camera. Where camera raw is literally a hunk of meat that you have to cook. So this kind of looks like a camera raw image that he didn't process. Or if he did it, if it was shot with as a JPEG, he doesn't have any settings being applied into his camera, because if you remember, JPEGs are prepared meatloaf, so all the settings and the way that the final output is directly related to the settings that you can go through the menus instead of your cameras, and you can change the contrast and pump up colors and change this and change that. And there's nothing wrong with that. However, and I'm sure many of you like to shoot in camera raw, because this is the opportunity for you to take full control over the final output and your vision for what you saw in this photograph. So in this case, just some simple tweaks here, a little contrast, a little pop of color, and we have ourselves a phenomenal photograph. And this is a great opportunity, as Jim so brilliantly has given us, is that we've taken something that's been done a million times and we turn it into a one-of-a-kind photograph that is just absolutely phenomenal. And this is a great example of those times where I'm just maybe having a mental block and I can't really think outside the box. I go a bit to the old bag of tricks of pulling out different techniques of panning and zooming and things like that to take an ordinary photo and not only make it your own, but make it extra extraordinary. So there you have it. Another week of critiques is in the book, and I want to thank all the contributing photographers this week of Serini, Steve, Richard, Sandy, and Jim. Thank you guys for sending in your photos so we can critique them here at Brian Peterson's School of Photography. And we hope to encourage everyone to submit some of their work so we can have critiques, because each week students will get their photos critiqued by randomly selected instructors. And it's a great way for not only you to learn, but also for anybody else who is looking to learn and get some insight in how we critique here at Brian Peterson's School of Photography. You can see exactly how we critique, and hopefully you'll sign up for one of our online courses, and maybe you can join me at my wildlife photography course right here at Brian Peterson's School of Photography. So with that being said, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you online at Brian Peterson's School of Photography.